dear colleagues, I guess we're all a bit tired, and this was the fruitful but such a long day. I tried to be as short as possible. And we put some pictures just to keep your attention in the presentation. And I want to start from the same point which well, mostly all of us started. We started to research the protest movement at 2011, back to December the 4th after the elections, because it was really fascinating events all across the country, not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but at the big cities all around the country. That was kind of also a political engagement, civic engagement in the protest events all the time. We tried to understand the same questions which shared by most scholars of Russia, let's say, winter protests in 2011-2012. Who were those people at the streets? Why they were protesting? Why all this suddenly ended, and so on. And just a few pictures to give you a glance what was happening across the country. This is Novosibirsk, December the 5th. This event was not approved by the authorities. A young guy who is standing right ahead of policemen. They are quarreling. This is the organizer. That was an event which cost about 100 people at the streets of Novosibirsk. Here's Omsk, February 4th. You see the different flags, Yabloko and communist flags, and all the colors came to the protest event. Here, the Chelyabinsk, December 10th. This event was organized by the Solidarity Movement and Kurgan. A bit different picture. You see the red flags and KPRF. Few people on the street, few protesters. Most of them are affiliated with communist movements. And here, Tyumen, December 10th, an unprecedented number of people, about 1,500, came out at the central square. Lots of police caps, lots of police at the streets. Rather unusual for our oil and gas-rich region, which is very calm and very unrevolutionary one, I guess, in the country. And here, how the events was following. This is the February 4th. Organizers agreed that flags wouldn't be shown at the street, so you can see just a few flags here, but also fewer people, much less people at the square. Here is the June 12th, March of Millions. At the streets, about 100 people and a half, and only communist flags are on the at the square. And here is the September 15th, again March of Millions. Well, the number of people is just the same, but again, just communist parties brought people, and we counted about maybe 10 or 15 new protesters from December 4th, 2011 here. So we started from wondering why all those people who were at the streets at 2011 dropped off. Where did they come? What's happened with them? And we tried to collect data from other cities around the Tyumen, so you can see Tyumen, Yekaterinburg, and Perm compared. The overall pattern is just the same, so we can see the upheaval at December 2011, and then drop-off of the protesters. But also there are some peculiarities, like in Yekaterinburg, protest sustained for a few months. Up to March 2012. In Perm, there were again some splashes, like in June 2012, and in Tyumen, after December 2011, the decrease was significant. So we started to understand what can we use, what analytical tools we can use to understand these regional differences and these regional peculiarities. I should confess that our research position was somehow affiliated with the movement, and also due to the absence of explanatory models or hypotheses, we just tried to collect the data and try to apply different models from contentions politics, Tarot, Tilly, Macadam, from framing process, and etc. And this was a fascinating process of trial and error to understand what was going on. And eventually we end up with the contentious politics or dynamic of contention paradigm. We collected data from the public opinion polls, from focus groups and interviews with new protesters in May-June 2012. So it's the common strategy for understand what was going on. We ended up with a kind of preliminary model of political mobilization. So the for fair election campaign in Tyumen mobilized, in our view, different groups and small networks up to 5 or 6 people. Not all of them are from middle class, I guess, but they are suddenly, they are surely middle income individuals, and this was a kind of cross-cutting groups at the streets. They shared the same communicative background, emotions and sense of disillusionment, anger and alienation from the power, from authorities, and it was the common background of the protesters in Tyumen. And try to understand why, for instance, in Omsk, Yekaterinburg, and Perm and other regional capitals, protest was a bit different. What was the explanatory model? So we try to put some ideas here, and again, here are some examples of what we heard from the new protesters about their feeling, again, indignations and injustice. So the framing process explains it very good. But eventually we ended up with the question of the repertoire of protest, with the question of what were the tools of making claims in different regions, and we started with the Tyumen case. So we tried to understand whether these new protesters follow the established traditions of contention. So we tried to put this for fair election campaign in a broader wave of contention, in a broader way of protests, and try to view from this angle what was happening in Tyumen during 2008-2012. And here is a quote which really helped us to come to our hypothesis from Delaporte and Diani, which indicates that the repertoire of protests or tactical repertoire is a kind of explanatory model to understand the movement culture, the activists' values. And we collected data regarding the protest events and their form, the number of participants in 2008-2012. So here is the description of the database. You can see it here. Well, I should say that data is limited only to public actions. It excludes the petitions, for instance, or cultural forms of protest like wearing white stripes or other forms, other signs, etc. We excluded the non-public events like gathering or discussion clubs and cinema clubs, where also protest events were discussed during this 5-year period. So this database is of course limited, but it allows us to understand some patterns. So here you can see the results of our calculations. Blue line is the protest action, the overall number of protest action. We see the gradual increase of protest actions from 2008 to 2011. Also, you can see that other public actions, non-protest actions, namely, were also in a kind of increase. And the green line is all actions covered by the media. I'd like again to stress that we try to use different sources of information. And this is media sources, notification from local to local authorities, and lists of observations, just to make these data more relevant and more fundamental. Here you can see that at 2010 the number of protests increased dramatically. New actors came into the field, into the scene. Well, lately I will give more details on this, on these patterns. So our observations. The gradual growth of protest actions, I've already mentioned it, and also changes in organizational environment from communist-dominated environment in 2008, where roughly the half of all the protest events were organized by communist parties, KPRF and Russian, let's say, Labor Peasant Party, RKRP. And in 2009, we saw that more actors came to the field, to the scene, anarchists, and then in 2010, conservative groups like parental committees, and in 2011, nationalists with Russian runs, etc. So we saw that prior to the mass demonstration at 2011, the organization field was already diversified and was already full of different actors trying to make their claims at the public field. Other political players rarely become initiators of protests, so Справедливая Россия, Just Russia, or LDPR, Liberal Democrats, very rarely became initiators. And non-institutional actors, individuals and their groups, accounts for 22% of overall actions. Most active groups are, again, like I guess in other big cities, cheated real estate investors and employees, urban dwellers against green zone cuts and point development. So it's a kind of agenda which is shared by the most urban movements. Here is the detailed figure diagram which depicts the number of events by initiators. You can see the communists are on the top, but also anarchists, which accounts for 9%, and other individuals, which accounts for roughly 16%. And we also have conservative groups and nationalists, and SIG stands for Soviet Council for Initiatives, Groups and Citizens, kind of umbrella organizations for all the protest movements which organized in 2010, and it still exists. Also, we find that average during the year there were about 2,000 with a half, 4,000 with a half participants of public protests, but with adjustment to big events like demonstration on the 1st May or November the 7th, it's less than 3,000 with a half. And new participants were rare, really rare, up to December 2011 events. Local and regional authorities use a wide range of counter strategies, counter tactics, but conventional repertoire is usually suppressed by routine non-approval by local authorities, while direct actions by citizens push authorities to interact with citizens. So if direct actions like road blockades appeared, officials reacted immediately, while other actors were marginalized. Local and regional media rarely cover protests due to established practices like self-censorship, dependence on governmental financing, and so on. You saw that media coverage accounts for half of the events we've counted. And the most common forms of contention are really conventional meetings and pickets. So you can see here the number of events by form. It's an absolute number just to give you the picture. And during 5 years of our observations, we saw that meetings and pickets are the most common form of protest, while others, let's say innovative one like gatherings or flash mobs and other forms are really rare, and gatherings appeared at the late 2010, and it's really a rare form of protest. So Russian runs. I don't know how to correctly translate it. Русские пробежки, by nationalists. Nationalist groups who just run with the flags, imperial flags, on the streets. They I guess invented this. Well, they just. This is a kind of diffusion of form. It was borrowed from the other cities, and nationalists began to use this. Really? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, Russian runs in 2011, I guess. We saw the first one, and then they spread up. Yep. And just to have some time to discuss conclusions, we saw that regional repertoire of contentions resonates with nationwide forms. Sorry for typos, some forms were particularly borrowed from the other places, like Occupy strategy, which we saw at May and June 2012, borrowed from Moscow, and Rambles. Also flash mobs and others widely used by anarchist organizations and groups were borrowed from the global movements. Now, most forms were really conventional. They were widely used by traditional protesters like communist groups, anarchists, trade unions, and innovations really did occur rarely or did not occur absolutely during the for fair election campaign, except Rambles and except Occupy strategy, which took place once in Tyumen at 2012. Non-institutional actors are likely to use direct actions, road closures and gatherings and hunger strikes, and this pushes authorities to react more immediately. And repertoire it depends much on organizers' experience and culture. We saw that communists, for instance, use the conventional tactics of meetings and demonstrations and marches, and anarchists, for instance, try to adopt the tactics from the global anarchist groups and movements. And also we can mention here the counter-mobilization strategy used by power holders. It was a whole bunch of instruments from non-approval to preventive talks and prosecution and litigation. Not much violence we saw during this period, but some of the protesters were really pressed by authorities. So I guess this is all. Thank you very much. We'd love to hear from you about your questions and so on. Thank you again.